Hello and welcome back to the Escape from Furnace Lockdown read-along with me, Alexander Gordon-Smith. Chapter 3. One Last Job. The house was empty. We knew it. Toby had been tipped off by a friend of a friend that the owners were away for the week, leaving behind enough electronic equipment to entertain a small country and a massive bundle of cash from their coffee shop business. But we were waiting outside just in case, cowering under a small bush in the back garden with only a solid wall of rain between us and a set of big windows. "Come on, Alex," muttered Toby, wiping water from his face. "It's emptier than Elvis's coffin in there." Toby had a thing for Elvis. He loved his music so much that he refused to believe the king was dead. I ignored the comment and scanned the back of the house. The lights were all off, and we hadn't seen a single movement from inside for the half hour we'd been here. Toby was right. It was probably empty, but the last thing I wanted was to run into some furious guy who'd decided to stay home. It had happened once before, when we'd hit a large house out in the countryside, and I'd come face to face with a man on the way to the toilet. We'd both stared at each other in shock for what seemed like hours, then screamed in perfect harmony. I turned and legged it, with him on my tail. It was even scarier than it sounds. He'd been stark naked. Fortunately, nothing like that had happened since, but I was eager to avoid any more encounters with homeowners, clothed or not. Toby nudged me, and I nodded, feeling a trickle of cold water slide down my back. We were sheltered from the worst of the downpour by the bush, but every now and again drips would snake down our faces and necks with an infuriating tickling sensation. Back then, I thought it was like Chinese water torture. I know different now. "Okay," I whispered, getting to my feet and rubbing the life back into my numb legs. It was a bitterly cold winter night, but through a break in the clouds, the light from the moon made the world glow like it was covered in silver polish. If I hadn't been so focused on breaking the law, I might have stopped to admire the sight. Taking a deep breath, I jogged across the garden to the sitting room windows, trampling over the flower beds to avoid making a noise on the gravel. I stopped when I heard an angry mutter behind me and turned to see Toby hopping across the mud on one leg and holding his other foot in his hands. "Cat crap!" he hissed at me, his expression one of disgust mixed with disbelief. "Why do I always manage to put my foot in crap?" I wanted to smile, but I couldn't. I was too pumped up. Adrenaline flooded my whole body like it did before every job, making my heart beat faster than a hummingbird's wings and sharpening my senses. I felt like an animal, aware of every sound and sight and smell and ready to turn and flee at the first sign of trouble. Reaching into the long pockets of my coat, I pulled out the only two pieces of equipment, aside from a flashlight, that a burglar ever needs: a glass cutter and the sticky dart from a toy gun. Licking the suction cup on the tip of the dart, I pressed it against the bottom right pane. After a couple of tugs to make sure it was secure, I pressed the blade to the glass and cut a smooth circle. Pocketing the cutter, I pulled the dart gently, and the glass popped free, leaving a handy hole in the window. "Voila!" I whispered, grinning despite the unbearable tension of the situation. "Do the honours, Topster." I stood to one side and looked at Toby, who was trying to clean his shoe on the soil of the flower bed. Each time he wiped it, giant clumps of mud stuck to the mess until his shoe was lost inside a massive brown ball, like he'd just put his foot through a coconut. "Toby!" I shouted. He snapped to attention, pouting. "These cost 100 quid, he said. "Well, buy yourself some new ones with the money you make tonight," I replied, running my hands through my soaking hair. "Buy yourself 20 pairs. Toby grinned back and walked to the window, sliding his small hand inside and fiddling with the clasp. After a few seconds there was a loud click and the window creaked open. "Wow," he said in shock. "That was almost too easy." I thought so too. It was too easy. I should have guessed then that something funny was going on, but greed is a powerful thing, and all I wanted was to get inside and get out again with as much loot as I could carry. If all went to plan, the proceeds from tonight would mean neither of us had to hit another house for months. "Right, let's do this," I said, gritting my teeth and pulling the window right open. The room inside was dark, but I could make out rows of shelves and a couple of sofas inside. Several unblinking red lights stared at us out of the shadows, and I imagined the eyes of some hellish guard dog that would bound from the darkness, fangs bared, ready to chew any intruders to pieces. But they weren't eyes. They were the standby lights from a fortune in electronics that would soon be safely in our bags. "I'll go first," said Toby. "Give me a leg up." He raised his foot, but I didn't move. "I'm not touching that," I said, looking at the giant clumps of mud and crap that looked like they'd been welded to his sneaker. "Why don't you give me a foot up?" He sighed and linked his two hands together to form a cradle. Bracing my foot in his grip, I pushed upward, getting one knee on the window frame and pulling myself inside. Scanning the dark interior to make sure it was empty, I skipped down onto the floor, not making a sound on the soft carpet. Toby was at the window holding 2 duffel bags, and I took them from him before grabbing his arm and hoisting him up. He was almost in when his soiled shoe slipped on the wood of the window frame. With a yelp that was deafening after the tense silence, he fell on me, sending us and a nearby plant stand crashing to the floor. For a second, neither of us could move a muscle. I lay there with Toby's weight on top of me, barely able to hear anything over my thrashing heart. But there was no sound of slamming doors, or terrified screams, or feet trampling down the stairs. At least we knew for sure that the house was empty. Toby's clumsiness would have woken the dead. Pushing him off me, I got to my feet and picked up my bag, offering Toby a hand. "Sorry about that," he said, sheepishly, pulling himself up. "Never mind, you lump," I replied. "You start putting away some of this electronic stuff. I'm going to go find the cash." 10-4, said Toby, pulling a flashlight from his bag and aiming the beam at the row of high-tech gadgets lined up underneath the enormous television. I left him to it, pulling out my own flashlight and making my way out of the door. You never really get over the sensation of being in someone else's house without their permission. Everything is different. The smell, the atmosphere, even the air tastes strange. I guess that's something to do with the reason I'm always in another person's home. It's as if the building itself doesn't want you there, like it's just waiting for you to slip up before it sucks you into some small, dark room forever. Trying to ignore my thoughts, I made my way down a hallway towards the stairs. According to Toby's friend of a friend, the owners had stashed the week's takings in a tin inside their office, along with a bundle of cash from a charity gig they'd held at the weekend. It should be a piece of cake. It was a fairly old house, but well taken care of, and the stairs didn't creak once as I made my way up. I swung my light to and fro to see where I was going, the shadows seeming to dance in front of me, like there was an army of goblins hiding in the corners and behind the furniture. I swallowed hard as I neared the top, cursing my imagination. There were 6 doors along the long landing, all closed. Carefully twisting the handle of the first, I found myself staring into a pristine white bathroom. The second door opened outwards, revealing an empty closet. Well, almost empty. As I was closing the door, something rushed at me out of the darkness, slapping me on the forehead. I just about screamed, fighting off my attacker before realising it was a mop. Shoving it back inside, I kicked the closet shut, no longer caring about noise, and walked past a small chest of drawers to the next door. 3rd time lucky, as they say. This one opened into a large room with a desk against one wall. I made my way straight to it and couldn't believe my eyes. On its walnut surface lay a stack of 10 and 20-pound notes, plus several bags full of coins, what must have been a couple of grand in all. It was as I was reaching for the cash, a massive grin on my face, that I heard the sound of screaming from downstairs. I froze, my skin turning to ice, my scalp seeming to shrivel up so tightly that it hurt. The house wasn't empty. Toby had been rumbled by what sounded like a very shocked woman, which meant he'd make for the nearest exit. I, on the other hand, was stuck up here. I snatched the notes and stuffed them into my pocket. When the shrieks started again, I realised I'd got it wrong. It wasn't the owner screaming. It was Toby. But the shock of that was nothing compared to the fright I got when I turned around. In the shadows behind the office door, right in front of me, was an enormous figure. A man whose black suit blended perfectly with the walls, but whose 2 glinting eyes and vast, sinister grin shone out of the darkness, like those of a shark in the cold, dead water of the ocean. Framed. I don't need to tell you what I did next. I ran straight for the open door, but the figure was too quick, slamming it shut and reaching out towards me with an arm the size of a tree trunk. I ducked, but he moved like lightning, grabbing the flashlight from my fist and throwing it at the wall. It smashed as it hit a shelf, plunging the room into darkness. Well, almost darkness. All I could see as I backed away from the man were his eyes, which still stood out from the shadows like 2 silver coins. They followed me each time I made a move, never blinking, and so bright that they seemed to burn right into my soul. I had to get out of the room. I had no idea who this guy was, but I was in his house, and judging by the size of it, he could turn me inside out without breaking a sweat. I was wondering whether I could leap through the window without killing myself when he spoke. "Where are you going to run to?" he said, his voice so deep that it sent a vibration through the floorboards. "I can see you, Alex." My heart seemed to stop for an instant as I heard my name. He couldn't know who I was. There was no way. We lived more than a mile away and we never came to this part of town unless we were hitting a house. Then it struck me. He was a cop. He'd been following Toby and me after a previous job, and he'd framed us by setting up this house as bait. The thought filled me with panic. At last, the thing I never thought would happen was finally happening. I was about to be busted. Another ear-piercing scream penetrated the room from downstairs. What the hell were the police doing to Toby? I suddenly wished I was back home, tucked away in bed and dreaming. I wished I'd never stolen that money from Daniel Richards, and I knew that if I didn't make it out of this room, I wouldn't be back in my own bed for months, maybe years. I fingered the money in my pocket, realising how pathetic I was to risk everything for a few £100, money that would be useless behind bars. But maybe it could prove useful here. Grabbing as many of the notes as I could, I wrenched them from my pocket and threw them at the man. I didn't wait to see what effect they'd have, but dived to the floor, rolling under his reach and scrambling to my feet on the other side of the room. I couldn't see the door. It was too dark. I slapped my hands furiously against the wall, knowing that I only had seconds before I felt the cop's huge hand on my shoulder. But there was nothing there except shelves and books. Risking a look behind me, I saw the man's 2 disembodied eyes race across the room, and it was all I could manage not to collapse to the floor screaming. Just as he was above me, however, my hand hit the door frame. Reaching across, I felt the handle and twisted it, ripping the door open so hard that it almost came off its hinges. It struck the man square in the face, but his only response was to laugh, a deep, grating rumble that followed me out onto the landing. "Run, Alex, run, Alex, run, run, run," came his voice as I felt my way to the top of the stairs. What the hell was going on? What kind of cop would say that? I was running too fast and I tripped on the top stair, almost plunging into darkness before I managed to get a hold on the banister. I tried to plan my escape route as I descended. Obviously, the room we came in through was now a no-go area. I had no intention of meeting whoever was in there with Toby. There was the front door, which lay directly ahead of the stairs, or I could try to find my way to the back of the house. Either way, I wouldn't get far in the dark. As it turned out, though, it wasn't the dark that got me. Almost as soon as I propelled myself from the bottom step, every light in the house was switched on simultaneously. I gasped and pressed my hands to my eyes, momentum flinging me into a wall. The illumination had completely thrown me, filling my head with stars and causing me to lose my bearings. I squinted against the glare to see that the hall was empty. A quick glance at the front door told me there were too many locks to force it open, so I started running towards the back, hoping for a quick exit. I couldn't tell you what happened next. I'm not sure if it was the fact that my eyes hadn't adjusted to the light, or if fear and adrenaline did something to my brain. But it was as if a figure simply stepped from the wall. One minute my path was clear, the next it was blocked by another mountainous man, so wide and so tall that he seemed to take up every centimetre of space. I skidded to a halt, mouth agape. This man, too, was dressed in a slick, black, pinstriped suit, with a white shirt and a black tie. He looked more like an undertaker than a cop. What scared me most about him, though, was his face. It seemed to be expressionless, and yet grinning at the same time, his silver eyes staring down at me with unmistakable glee, like a boy about to squash a bug. "Boo!" he said, his thick voice just as deep and dangerous as that of the man upstairs. I staggered backwards, shaking my head. The man had left only one escape route, the way we'd come in. I bolted through the sitting room door, ready to fling myself screaming from the window, but what I saw in that room drained the strength from my body, turning my legs to jelly. It took everything I had to remain upright. The room, which had been deserted less than 5 minutes ago, was now full of men. Each was almost identical in size, dwarfing the furniture and making the large space feel like a doll's house. Each almost identical in looks too, like brothers. And they were all wearing the same immaculate black suits. I counted 4 in all, and the sound of footsteps behind me made it clear that the other 2 were in the hall. But the figure I couldn't take my eyes off was standing in between the giants, twitching and shaking like he was having a fit. He looked tiny in comparison, barely reaching the elbows of his comrades, and he wore a long black leather coat that made his bald head look like pale parchment. I knew now why Toby had been screaming. The man was wearing what looked like a gas mask, an antique, rusted device that covered the lower part of his face and stretched over his shoulder to a tank on his back, like the ones worn by divers. He wheezed noisily through the ancient contraption as if he was having an asthma attack. Peering over the top of the mask, like 2 raisins set into rancid porridge, were his eyes, and the way they stared at me made me want to curl up and die. It took me a few moments to notice the frail, shaking body of Toby on the floor beneath one of the men in black. He stared at me with a look of pure terror, his eyes wide, pleading for me to help him. I didn't know what to do. I didn't even know who the men were. Taking another look at the shriveled figure by the window, I found myself praying for the familiar uniforms of the police, not this freak show of gas masks and Goliaths. "Nice of you to join us, Alex," said the huge black-suited man who was standing above Toby. His face was a mirror image of the others, only with what looked like a small mole on his chin. His voice, too, was indistinguishable from those I had already heard, like distant thunder. "It looks like everyone here knows my name," I said, the words coming out of my mouth before I even knew I was speaking. Despite the terror that rooted me to the spot, I was determined not to give these men the satisfaction of seeing my fear. If I'd known there was a party here tonight, I'd have brought some cake. To my surprise, the men all chuckled at my joke, a noise so deep that it made the remaining glass in the window vibrate. It was the most terrifying sound I'd ever heard. "We wanted to surprise you," the man continued. "Well then arrest us," I said, just waiting to get out of that room. "You've caught us red-handed. Take us down to the station and we'll confess." The same grating laughter that set my teeth on edge. When it had finished, the giant man turned to his smaller friend as if awaiting a command. Seconds rolled past while the freak in the gas mask studied me and Toby. Then he turned his dark eyes to me and nodded. "What?" I asked, desperate to know what was going on. "What the hell does this guy want?" "He wants you to say goodbye to your friend," the man continued. I shook my head, the fear and confusion churning in my stomach. Were they just going to take me and not Toby? "What?" I repeated. Toby was no longer looking at me, but he was staring at the carpet, sobbing uncontrollably. "They've got guns with silencers," he said, his voice little more than a whisper. "They're not police, Alex." I didn't understand what Toby had said until the giant man opened his suit jacket to reveal a holstered pistol tucked beneath his armpit. For a second, I felt the world spin, as if I was about to pass out, and by the time I'd regained my composure, the man had pulled out a silenced handgun and was pointing it at me. "Last chance to say goodbye," he said. I looked at Toby, wanting this nightmare to end, thinking about the things I'd never be able to do if the man pulled the trigger, thinking about how much I'd miss my friends, how much I loved my family, all lost because of greed. It was so stupid. I couldn't control my emotions anymore, and tears filled my eyes, blurring my vision. All I could see was the outline of the man and the black shadow that was his gun. "Goodbye, Toby," I said through sobs. "I'm sorry." "Alex," was all I heard of his reply. Then the black shadow moved, sweeping downwards and emitting a low pop that was barely audible against the laughter that once again filled the room. I tried to blink the tears from my eyes, not quite believing what I'd seen, but when my vision cleared, I realised there was no escaping what had just happened. Toby lay motionless, his eyes blank, the carpet beneath his body the same horrible colour as the wound in his head. It seemed like hours before anyone moved again. It felt as if the connection between my brain and my body had been severed, turning every limb numb. I wanted to feel anger, hatred, sorrow, anything, but all I could do was stare at my friend, at the body that would never move again, a corpse with one dirty shoe. My legs finally gave way and I sank to my knees. "Catch!" came the booming voice. The giant man tossed the gun to me and I reached out instinctively, grabbing it by the handle and staring at it in shock. For a second I pointed it at the black-suited brute, but I barely held a toy gun before, let alone a real one, and I quickly tossed it to the floor. "Now, if I were you, Alex, I'd make a run for it," he continued. "I mean, you've just broken into a house, stolen a load of cash, and shot your best friend in the head in cold blood. The police aren't going to like you one little bit. So why don't you put those sneakers to good use and run?" I couldn't respond. I didn't know what he was talking about, but suddenly I felt an enormous pair of arms grip me under my arms and hoist me effortlessly to my feet. The same hands turned me around and pushed me roughly towards the front door, which had been unlocked and opened. "Good luck, Alex," came the voice from behind me. "Run as hard as you can, or sit and cower outside. Either way, we'll see you real soon." I turned and saw the face of the man in black break into a monstrous smile, all teeth and slitted eyes. Then I took one last look at Toby, at rest on his crimson bed, and bolted out into the rain. And I'll see you tomorrow for chapter 5, On the Run.